Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Oh, here we go. See, there are more people coming. Hi. Make yourself at home. Have a seat wherever you feel comfortable. My name is Cheryl Singsank, and I am in the Marketing and Communications Department. And I've had the pleasure of getting to know Dr. Shaw and being involved in some of his initiatives. And just so happens that we both went through the same yoga certification program. I found out last August when I went to his yoga in the park in Nashville, Illinois. So that was interesting. So that was within the first month or so that I was working here. But so we've kind of come a long way since last August. We're making progress and getting some of helping to promote some of his initiatives. Dr. Shaw has a practice, a family medicine practice, primary care practice in
November.
That new construction, right, that's outside here, that's where he will then be moving his practice. So he's currently. So Dr. Shaw has a fellowship in obesity medicine, and we're finding that to be obviously a very supportive practice for like someone needing orthopedic surgery that might need to lose some weight so that their surgery is more successful, or maybe someone with diabetes. So it parlays into a lot of different areas, that particular risk factor of weight. So we're thrilled to have him, and we had a very good reception for the Intro to Weight Management program about a month ago. We had close to 50 people here as well. We are recording, and then we can let you know where you would be able to find the link if you were so interested, or you're interested in future programs. We will send out to the email list and the mail list.
Or sharing with others to get million links or likes.
Yeah, there we go. Get all those links. So. Anyway, it'll probably be on the Memorial's YouTube page. I'm not exactly sure yet, so we're working on that. Can you think of anything else?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. And help yourself to refreshments during the break or whatever.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for a nice introduction there, and thank you, everyone, to be here today. This is very interesting topic of yoga that we're going to talk about today, and it always gets a little fascinating or interesting when a physician takes interest into it. Before we go into yoga lecture, I just want to share some of the identifications that I have. Obviously, I consider myself as a Hindu American. And also, the other identity I have is I practice exclusive plant-based diet. The reason I'm disclosing those two identities is that if you see any of the biases throughout the lecture, please forgive me, if pertaining to any of those two identities that I have. The other things, as Cheryl mentioned, that I'm a family physician. I was trained in Chicago for a Rush program. And had been practicing for the last 4 years. 3 years I had been practicing at Nashville, Illinois. And fairly recently, last few months, I was brought into this area for leading two specific programs. One is a weight loss clinic that we want to offer to our community, and the second would be yoga therapy program that we still have in the frame of vision. We haven't really materialized our plan yet, but hopefully this lecture is the start of that. Obviously, Cheryl mentioned I'm also a certified yoga teacher. However, I have not used my time for teaching yoga as much I would like. Besides the few yoga in park or some small 6 weeks program or something, but most of my time devoted to the research, philosophical, spiritual, and the mostly personal practice of the yoga. And so I thought that this might be an avenue to expand my knowledge and bring that to the community. So there are essentially a few objectives that I have for the lecture. The first objective is I want to bring more authenticity to yoga practices. Second objective I have is, as we have seen, is not only last couple of years, but it's always been. We've seen so many different polarities in our little world, or even at the national level, or across the world, and how we can bring or build bridges in such a polarized world, and a different and almost every topics we find people are polarized. And the other third objective that I want to accomplish this lecture is give more philosophical, intellectual, maybe logical, scientific foundation to the yoga, which is a very important aspect for the physical aspect of yoga, which we see in commercialized popular culture. And then last objective is essentially I want to talk about what we can offer, what kind of program that we want to shape into. And so I would briefly talk about what potentially we'll do with this program. So when I mentioned about authenticating yoga, what I really mean by that, before I go into the meaning of that, I just want to go through the brief history and the definition of yoga. I'm sure, depending on your background and your practice of yoga, or rather you have never practiced, or you come from curiosity, or you've already been practicing, or and you want to learn more, or what doctor has to offer in terms of yoga, or how he combines, whatever the reasons why you're here. You may have your own definitions based on resources that you may have encountered in the past. I'm just going to give another twist or meaning to it. So the history of yoga, I don't want to go too much into the ancient history, but I would certainly refer or mention the name. As you know that around 500 or 400 before Common Era, we had a Gautam, and his practice become later incorporated in religion and become Buddhism. And then we had another significant historical character, Mahavir, and that later became the religion of Jainism. And around the same era, there was another individual, often not quite mentioned, but I revered, or I think of him as a father of modern yoga. Now, I would like to emphasize modern. We're talking about a few hundred century BCE. We consider modern India. And that name is Patanjali. You may have heard of his name. He has a significant contribution in the world of yoga. He was not the inventor of yoga, nor yoga started with him, but his contribution was the compilation of all the different types and schools of yoga that those existed that era in ancient India, or in that time. And he made a very concise and comprehensive art of book, are gifted to us, and which essentially has 4 different chapters and has only 196 lines. So how concise that was. So significant contribution that would give him a title of father of modern yoga. There are a couple other contributions that he had. There are some historical controversies, rather. There's another character with the same name, or he has done it. There is other field called Ayurveda, which is Veda essentially means knowledge, and Ayur is sort of a science of longevity, or the life knowledge of life sciences. And he also had done the similar work in the field of Ayurveda. And then third aspect he had contributed was the Vyakaran. Vyakaran is essentially a grammar, so he had a significant contribution in compiling various aspects of grammar, and so contributions in linguistic, a field of Indian languages, and some people even claim that all the Indo-European languages that has some root from that grammar aspect of it. Again, his contribution is more compilation than creativity. However, you have to be at a certain status or level of yogi to compile all the knowledge. So he was certainly a very renowned yogi himself to do so. Now, in other words, that he has given a science, yoga, to purify the mind. He has given the science of Ayurveda to purify the body, and he also given the grammar to purify the language. So that's the very significant contribution, at least for the India, maybe in a larger context, if you talk about yoga, significant contribution to the world. So that's essentially a brief history. There are many other historical aspects and the characters that goes prior to him, and I don't really want to talk too much about that, because some of the things are either a sort of a historical, some of the aspects is myth, or some of the aspect is actual history, sometimes hard to talk about without any controversial reference. So I would just leave that aside. The other aspect of, besides the history, the definitions of yoga. Now, when we talk about yoga, we precisely think of some sort of a studio setting, various poses. Some of them are very exotic, some of them are very simplified, and that's the first thing comes to our mind when we talk about yoga. Now, that is only one organ or one aspect of yoga has been popularized in Western culture, and so that's one of the reasons why we often don't get the message of or the underlying message of the yoga. So the way I define yoga, as you may have heard these definitions before, since I give a credit to Patanjali, I just reference his book, and his first chapter, he defines yoga. He says, yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Now, the chitta is a Sanskrit word. It's very difficult to find an English equivalent to it. But you can think of as a consciousness or individual consciousness, or maybe a pure intelligence, or however you want to translate it in English. Vritti is essentially any modifications, whether sensory modifications like the body with a sense, or the thought modifications, all the thoughts and the mind aspect of it. Nirodha means eradicate. So the moment you eradicate all the sensory and the thought modifications from the consciousness, that entire process is essentially yoga. Now, that is a literal definition of yoga by the father of yoga. Now, in a even different way of looking at what yoga would be is a philosophical standpoint. When you look at yourself, your existence, your individualities, we all recognize that we exist, and we have certain sensory boundaries, and we possess certain thoughts. But we also know that there is something beneath us that we call existence or consciousness, or in a religious reference they call soul, or in a Sanskrit term they call Atman, or various other classifications of identifying who you are as an individual. Expanding this consciousness and dissolving your sensory and the thought processes, and expanding your consciousness and be part of, or be one with, everything and everyone surrounding. That is essentially a different way of defining yoga. So I don't know if you have heard this kind of definitions before, or this is completely new or very philosophical. It's hard to find philosophy from doctors, but I will try my best to try to make sense. Now, that's another way of looking at it. In a simplest way, in a practical way of looking at yoga is just being more conscious and aware of yourself, that there is some of you, your identity is something other than your body and mind. That's bringing more and more your conscious experience in your life. You can also think of that as a yoga. That's more of the most simplistic way of looking at the definition of yoga. Now, the yoga that we see in the studios and in a popular culture, which is there's a term called hatha yoga, or is largely dedicated to one aspect of yoga, which involves the asana, or which involves the postures and various sequence of the postures. But there is a lot more goes beneath and the intention of what we do in the studio, which is often it's not quite visible, but that's essentially what definition of yoga that contains a little more spiritual sense to it, non-physical sense of it. Now, when I mentioned earlier authenticating yoga, so there are two forces in our world that makes us to get rid of some of the components of the yoga, and you can think of as it makes it less authentic. And what are those two forces? One force is essentially sort of a fear or the phobia of religious baggage that goes with the yoga. So whenever we belong to a specific faith or belief or religion, whenever we feel like through yoga we're trying to get some other religion into it, precisely Hinduism or Buddhism, then sometimes we happen to drop some of the components of the yoga. And that does not happen with a negative intention. That happens just naturally. So that's one process that has been happening over time, that yoga is becoming, some of the relevant component gets dropped from the yoga. The other side of the aisle, the scientific community, whenever some of the components of the yogas are not verified by science or by the evidence, we tend to drop those aspects as well. And the commercialization of the yoga don't like either of those communities. Commercialization of the yoga don't like to disappoint either side of the aisle, so they try to eliminate as many relevant components of the yogas. And so when I say authenticating yoga, it means that first, we don't want to have any significant phobia of any religion, and also sometimes we need to rely on our experience, whatever the elements of the yoga that we incorporate in our practice, is it making difference in our lives? Sometimes that subjective experience can trump the scientific verification. So sometimes you can allow certain components of the yoga in your practice or facilitate your practice to without a scientific verification. So we want to relieve these two forces, or the fear of these two forces, and make yoga more authentic. The reason of bringing more authenticity to the yoga is, it's like, I give this example, if you travel across the world, specifically food, there are certain kinds of foods come from Mexico, or some come from Italy, and the type of food that we eat here, let's say, pick an example of pizza. If you have been living in Chicago and you've been eating pizza in Chicago and then you travel to Italy, you would feel like, oh my gosh, this is not a pizza, you know. But that's where it comes from. So the same kind of process happens with yoga. and that in the process of, and we really lose the relevance of yoga. Still, there are some of the vital components are still propagated in popular culture, so still is effective. But if you bring some of the other authentic elements into yoga, you can probably surprise yourself to make your yoga practices a little more relevant. Yoga is certainly a self-realized wisdom that without any miracle or without any specific belief or faith or doctrine or even psychological manipulations or hypnotism or all of that above, yoga is without wisdom, without all of those. So we want to make that very much clarification. But anytime if you feel a little threat to your personal faith, it's okay not to include those things, but I would say you should also work on rather introspecting, whether it's a real fear or whether it's just a non-existent fear or is actually it's happening. So that's something that I would. So the process of authenticating yoga is not so much about doing something continue doing something still even though it's not working. That's not what I'm expecting from people to do that. If some components of yoga, if it's not working, you can definitely drop it. So you really want to make it more an experiential level instead of just doing it just for the sake of it. The authenticating yoga is very important to facilitate your practice, to get the better outcome and better result, not to create any sort of conflict within you. Now, so in our American experiment, or you can think of as a Western experiment of last many centuries, we have succeeded remarkably to create a comfort and a little bit of sanity and external, but we cannot claim that we have done the same thing in inner well-being. And that's why the yoga becomes very essential even in the modern world, that along with our external well-being, yoga can also empower us in the inner well-being. So yoga has an immense amount of subjective tools to bring inner well-being. That's how I put it in terms of efficacy of that. And obviously, we want to give homage or royalty or credit where it comes from when you try to incorporate all the components of the yogas. And so that's another reason why we want to, we like things are more authentic in every aspect of our lives.